Have you ever wondered what might be hiding in a place so deep, so ancient, and so isolated that no human eyes were ever meant to see it? Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy mysterious disappearances, unexplained creatures, haunted locations, and terrifying horror stories inspired by real places, then you're in the right place. Tonight, we are descending into one of the most mysterious places on Earth, a labyrinth of darkness stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the surface. Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the unknown. Because tonight's story takes us deep beneath Kentucky, into the endless tunnels of Mammoth Cave, where a team of explorers discovered something that was never meant to be found. This is the story of the thing waiting in Mammoth Cave. Nobody on the expedition expected history to change that morning. The mission was supposed to be routine. Mammoth Cave, known as the longest cave system in the world, had been explored and mapped for generations. While new passages were occasionally discovered, most additions were minor extensions of existing tunnels. Nothing suggested that this particular survey would be different. Dr. Ethan Mercer, a veteran cave explorer with nearly 2 decades of experience, believed the assignment would be straightforward. Accompanying him were geologist Sarah Whitmore, cave navigator Ben Foster, filmmaker Jacob Reed, biologist Mia Sullivan, climbing specialist Tyler Brooks, and graduate researcher Lisa Harper. Their objective was simple: investigate a recently exposed section of cave revealed by seasonal flooding, document the area, collect samples, and return to the surface. The first several hours passed without incident. Their helmet lights illuminated winding corridors of limestone while droplets of water echoed through the darkness. Sarah collected geological samples from the walls while Jacob recorded footage for a documentary. The atmosphere was calm and professional. Around midday, however, the team encountered something unusual. Hidden behind a narrow crack in the cave wall was a passage that appeared nowhere on any official survey. At first it seemed insignificant, just another small opening revealed by erosion, but when Ben shined his flashlight into the gap, he realized the tunnel extended far beyond what anyone expected. The group gathered around the opening and studied it carefully. Something felt wrong. The walls surrounding the passage appeared strangely smooth compared to the rough limestone formations around them. Sarah suggested it might have been formed by ancient water flow, but even she sounded uncertain. Ethan examined the stone closely and noticed subtle differences in texture and color. The rock looked older somehow, as if it belonged to a completely different cave system buried within Mammoth Cave itself. After documenting the discovery, Ethan made the decision to investigate further. One by one, the explorers squeezed through the narrow opening and entered the unknown passage. Almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. The air grew noticeably colder, and their footsteps echoed in a strange way that none of them could explain. Every sound seemed to travel farther than it should have, bouncing endlessly through the darkness ahead. The tunnel continued for nearly half a mile before suddenly opening into an enormous chamber. As the explorers stepped inside, they found themselves standing in a space so vast that their lights could not reach the ceiling. Massive stone pillars rose from the floor like the ruins of an ancient underground city. The darkness above seemed endless. For several moments, nobody spoke. Even the experienced members of the team stood frozen in awe. Jacob slowly turned his camera in every direction, struggling to capture the immense scale of the chamber. Sarah removed her helmet and stared upward. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. This room was far larger than any chamber recorded in the existing maps of Mammoth Cave. It was impossible that such a massive space had remained hidden for so long. Yet there it was, untouched and silent beneath the earth. As the team began exploring the chamber, Mia noticed strange formations arranged across the floor. At first they appeared to be clusters of stalagmites, but as they approached, it became clear that they were not natural formations at all. The structures had been arranged in deliberate patterns, circles, rows, and geometric designs that seemed intentional. Sarah knelt beside one of the formations and carefully brushed away centuries of mineral deposits. The moment she realized what she was looking at, the color drained from her face. They were bones. Thousands of them. Human bones. Animal bones. Bones from creatures that none of them could immediately identify. Over countless years, mineral-rich water had fused the remains together into towering structures resembling stone monuments. The discovery transformed the atmosphere instantly. What had begun as an exciting scientific expedition suddenly felt like an intrusion into a forgotten place that should have remained hidden. Nobody could explain how so many remains had ended up in such a remote chamber deep beneath the earth. As they continued their survey, the mysteries only multiplied. Strange symbols were carved into the walls. Deep claw-like grooves stretched across the stone surfaces. Circular depressions covered sections of the floor, and everywhere they looked they found more evidence that someone, or something, had occupied the chamber long ago. The carvings were unlike any known Native American markings found elsewhere in the region. Some symbols appeared almost impossibly old, softened by thousands of years of mineral growth. Others looked disturbingly fresh. Hours passed as the team documented every detail. The excitement of discovery slowly gave way to unease. It felt as though they were being watched. Nobody said it aloud at first, but each member of the expedition experienced the same unsettling sensation. Several times they thought they heard distant movements beyond the reach of their lights. Whenever they stopped to listen, however, the sounds disappeared into silence. Then Lisa found another passage. The opening was concealed behind one of the largest stone pillars in the chamber. Unlike the natural tunnel they had entered through, this passage was almost perfectly circular. Its walls were smooth and symmetrical, as though shaped deliberately rather than formed through natural geological processes. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, vanishing into absolute darkness. When Ben activated his scanning equipment, the device immediately began malfunctioning. It struggled to determine the depth of the tunnel, producing inconsistent readings before shutting itself down entirely. The group stood silently at the entrance. Even their most powerful lights could not reveal the end of the passage. The darkness seemed thicker there, almost physical in its presence. Ethan knew they had already discovered enough to justify ending the expedition. The hidden chamber alone would attract worldwide attention. The bones, the carvings, and the unexplored tunnels represented one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in modern history. Every logical part of his mind told him it was time to leave. But curiosity is a powerful force. Especially underground. Especially in a place that no human being had ever documented before. After a brief discussion, Ethan made the decision that would change everything. They would continue. One by one, the explorers entered the descending tunnel. The temperature dropped further with every step. The air became strangely stale, carrying an unfamiliar odor that none of them could identify. Behind them, the chamber slowly disappeared from view. Ahead lay only darkness. The tunnel continued downward for what felt like miles, leading them deeper beneath the earth than any mapped section of Mammoth Cave. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the reach of their lights, a faint sound echoed through the darkness. At first it was so distant they thought it might be flowing water. Then they heard it again. A slow scraping noise. Like something enormous dragging itself across stone. The sound lasted only a few seconds before vanishing. The tunnel fell silent once more. None of them realized it then, but they had already crossed a threshold. They were no longer exploring Mammoth Cave. They were entering a place that had remained hidden for thousands of years. A place where something ancient had survived in the darkness. And for the first time in a very long time, it had become aware that it was no longer alone. Nobody moved as the sound echoed through the chamber once more. It was deeper now, stronger, vibrating through the stone floor beneath their boots. The noise didn't sound like an animal call or shifting rock. It sounded alive. A slow, resonating breath seemed to rise from the darkness itself. Every member of the team stood frozen, their helmet lights pointed toward the entrance of the corridor beyond the stone doorway. Then came another sound, a long scrape against stone, followed by silence, and then another scrape. Something was moving in the darkness. Something heavy. Something impossibly large. With each passing second, the sound grew closer. Ethan felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Every instinct told him to run, yet curiosity and disbelief kept him rooted in place. He slowly raised his flashlight and directed the beam toward the corridor. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then, for a fraction of a second, the darkness shifted. A shape crossed the edge of the light. It was there and gone so quickly that Ethan almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But he knew what he had seen. The figure was far too tall to be human. It appeared to duck beneath the ceiling of the tunnel, its elongated limbs bending at impossible angles before disappearing once again into the shadows. "What the hell was that?" Tyler whispered. Nobody answered because nobody wanted to admit what they had witnessed. Jacob's hands trembled as he continued filming. For a brief moment, his camera captured a pale silhouette standing motionless at the far end of the passage. Then the screen erupted into static before abruptly shutting down. Jacob stared at the dead device in disbelief. The battery had been fully charged only hours earlier. "It killed the camera," he said. "That's impossible," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked confidence. The scraping noise stopped. Silence returned, but this silence felt different. It was heavy and deliberate, as if the darkness itself were listening. Ethan turned his attention back to the stone tablet they had recovered from the skeleton. There had to be a reason someone had hidden this place. There had to be a reason the chamber, the bones, and the carvings had remained buried beneath Mammoth Cave for so long. Sarah examined the symbols more closely. The carvings seemed random at first, but the longer she studied them, the more patterns began to emerge. Her expression slowly changed from confusion to realization. "I think we've been looking at this the wrong way," she said. The others gathered around her. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Sarah pointed toward a sequence of repeating symbols carved across the surface. These symbols appear together over and over. They're not describing rituals. They're describing imprisonment. Nobody spoke. "The people who made these carvings weren't worshipping whatever lived down here," she continued. "They were trying to contain it." A cold wave of dread swept through the room. Suddenly the murals covering the wall seemed different. The figures surrounding the giant creature no longer looked like worshippers gathered around a god. They looked like terrified people carrying out a desperate task. The realization struck Ethan with horrifying clarity. Thousands of years ago, someone had discovered whatever existed beneath Mammoth Cave. And instead of killing it, they had sealed it away. The scraping sound returned. This time it came from directly outside the room. The floor vibrated beneath their feet. Fine dust drifted from the ceiling as if something massive had brushed against the stone. Tyler immediately gripped his climbing axe while Ben instinctively stepped backward. "We need to leave," Ben said. For the first time since entering the hidden tunnel, nobody argued. They had already uncovered enough mysteries for a lifetime. Every instinct now screamed the same warning. "Leave. Immediately." Ethan nodded. "We're heading back. Right now." The team quickly gathered their equipment and moved toward the doorway. But as they approached the entrance, Lisa suddenly stopped. Her flashlight illuminated something carved into the stone wall beside the opening. Something none of them remembered seeing before. 4 deep grooves. Fresh grooves. The claw marks stretched nearly 6 feet across the rock. Stone dust still rested beneath them. The edges were sharp and clean, untouched by age or mineral buildup. Mia stared at them in disbelief. Those weren't here before. Nobody wanted to ask how she knew. Deep down, they all understood she was right. Whatever had made those marks had done so recently. Very recently. Then Ben's flashlight flickered once and went dark. A second later, Tyler's light failed. One by one, the lamps throughout the group began shutting off. The darkness seemed to surge toward them like a living thing. Within seconds, only Ethan's flashlight remained operational. Its beam cut through the corridor and illuminated the passage beyond the doorway. And there, standing at the far end of the tunnel, was a figure. Nobody knew how long it had been watching them. The creature stood completely still. Its skin was pale gray, almost white, blending unnaturally with the surrounding stone. It was impossibly thin, yet incredibly tall, nearly touching the ceiling of the corridor. Its arms hung so low they almost reached the ground. But the most horrifying feature was its face. There was no face. No eyes. No nose. No recognizable features. Only a massive vertical mouth running from the top of its head to the bottom of its neck. Slowly, the mouth opened. Rows upon rows of needle-like teeth became visible inside the darkness. The team froze. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. For several endless seconds, the creature simply stood there, silent and motionless. Then its head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying them. And then it smiled. A sound emerged from deep within its throat. It was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. The noise echoed through the underground world like the cry of something ancient, something that had existed long before human civilization ever touched the surface. The scream rolled through the tunnels, shaking dust from the ceiling and sending waves of terror through every member of the expedition. Then the creature took a single step forward. The sound of its foot striking stone echoed through the darkness. Another step followed. And another. Whatever had been imprisoned beneath Mammoth Cave for thousands of years was no longer hiding. It had awakened. And for the first time in countless centuries, it had found new prey. For a moment, nobody moved. The creature continued its slow advance down the corridor, each step producing a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the ancient tunnels. Ethan's flashlight trembled in his hand as the beam remained fixed on the towering figure. Every rational thought in his mind struggled to accept what he was seeing. This thing should not exist. Nothing like it belonged anywhere on Earth. Yet it was there, moving toward them with terrifying patience, as if it knew there was no need to rush. The team stood frozen in a state between disbelief and panic until Tyler finally shouted, "Run!" The command shattered the paralysis that had gripped them, and the entire group turned and sprinted deeper into the chamber they had just discovered. Their footsteps thundered across the stone floor as they rushed past the ancient murals and piles of offerings. Behind them, the creature's scream echoed once more, louder than before. The sound reverberated through the walls, causing loose fragments of rock to rain down from the ceiling. Jacob nearly dropped his camera as he ran, while Ben struggled to keep pace with the others. The darkness around them seemed alive now, shifting and twisting beyond the reach of their lights. Every shadow felt threatening. Every tunnel entrance looked like a place where another nightmare might emerge. As they burst back into the chamber filled with bones, Ethan risked a glance over his shoulder. The creature had not accelerated. It was still walking. Slowly. Deliberately. Yet somehow the distance between them continued to shrink. It moved with a horrifying efficiency, covering impossible amounts of ground without appearing to increase its speed. The sight sent a fresh wave of terror through Ethan's body. It wasn't chasing them like a predator hunting prey. It was advancing with complete confidence, as though escape was impossible and time meant nothing to it. The team hurried toward the tunnel that would lead them back to the upper levels of Mammoth Cave. But as they approached the entrance, Sarah suddenly stopped. Her flashlight swept across the floor, revealing something that hadn't been there before. More claw marks. Fresh ones. Deep grooves cut into the stone, stretching across the passage like a warning. Ethan stared in disbelief. The creature had been behind them only moments ago. There was no way it could have reached this location first. Yet the evidence was right in front of them. A terrible realization settled over the group. Whatever they were dealing with was not limited by the rules of ordinary movement. Before anyone could speak, a deafening crash erupted somewhere above. The entire chamber shook violently. Cracks spread across the ceiling, and chunks of stone began breaking loose. A massive section of rock collapsed near the tunnel entrance, sending dust and debris exploding into the air. The impact knocked several members of the team off their feet. When the dust began to settle, their escape route was gone. Tons of rock now blocked the passage completely. Panic spread instantly. "No, no, no!" Ben shouted as he rushed toward the collapse. He scrambled over the rubble, searching desperately for a gap large enough to squeeze through, but there was nothing. The tunnel was sealed. Ethan felt his heart sink. They were trapped. The only known route back to the surface had been destroyed. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, the creature was still coming. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The reality of their situation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. They were deeper underground than any recorded expedition had ever gone. Their navigation equipment had stopped working. Communication with the surface had been lost hours earlier. And now their only path home was buried beneath thousands of pounds of stone. Then Mia noticed something. "Listen," she whispered. Everyone fell silent. At first Ethan heard nothing except the ringing in his ears. Then, slowly, another sound emerged from the darkness. It was faint. Rhythmic. Drip. 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 Water. Mia pointed toward a narrow crack hidden behind one of the bone-covered pillars. Cold air flowed from the opening. Unlike the stale atmosphere surrounding them, this air felt fresh. Moving. "There might be another way out," she said. The group exchanged uncertain looks. They had no maps. No knowledge of where the passage led. But they had no alternatives. Ethan nodded. "Move." One by one they squeezed through the narrow opening and entered another unexplored tunnel. This passage was tighter than the others, forcing them to move single file. The walls pressed close on either side, and the ceiling dipped so low that they were often forced to crouch. The further they traveled, the stronger the sound of running water became. For the first time in hours, a small spark of hope appeared. Underground rivers often connected to known cave systems. If they could find flowing water, perhaps they could find a route back to the surface. That hope lasted less than 10 minutes. The tunnel eventually widened into a cavern unlike anything they had seen before. Their lights revealed a vast underground lake stretching into darkness. The black water was perfectly still, reflecting their beams like polished glass. Massive stone columns rose from the lake's surface, disappearing into the darkness above. The chamber felt impossibly ancient, untouched for countless millennia. And then Jacob's flashlight illuminated something floating near the shore. A body. Everyone froze. The figure drifted silently in the water, face down. At first Ethan assumed it was a recent victim who had somehow wandered into the cave. But as the body slowly rotated in the water, the truth became clear. The corpse was ancient. Its flesh had long since decayed, leaving only darkened skin stretched tightly across bone. Mineral deposits covered much of its surface, suggesting it had been submerged for centuries. Or longer. Then another body drifted into view. And another. And another. Dozens of them floated silently across the black lake. Hundreds more could be seen farther out in the darkness. The entire underground lake was filled with the dead. Ancient human remains drifting endlessly through the still water. A horrifying silence fell over the group as they stared at the grim scene. None of them noticed the movement beneath the water until it was too late. Something enormous shifted below the surface. The lake rippled. One of the floating corpses suddenly disappeared beneath the black water. Then another. Then another. The ripples spread outward across the cavern. And from somewhere deep beneath the lake, a pair of massive pale shapes slowly began rising toward the surface. The ripples spread across the surface of the underground lake, growing wider and more violent with each passing second. The floating corpses drifted apart as unseen currents moved beneath them. Every member of the team stood frozen at the shoreline, unable to look away. Slowly, the pale shapes rising from the depths became clearer. At first, Ethan thought they were enormous rocks being lifted by some underwater current. Then one of the shapes moved. It flexed. Bent. Curled inward before extending again. A wave of horror swept through him as he realized he was looking at fingers. Massive fingers. Something beneath the lake was reaching upward. The black water suddenly erupted. A towering limb burst through the surface, sending ancient corpses scattering in every direction. Water crashed against the rocky shoreline while the explorers stumbled backward in panic. The limb was pale white, almost translucent, covered in strange ridges and scars. It looked vaguely human, but its proportions were horribly wrong. The arm alone appeared longer than a school bus. As the water continued churning, a second arm emerged nearby, followed by a shape so large that the team could not immediately comprehend what they were seeing. The thing beneath the lake was colossal. Its body remained mostly hidden beneath the surface, but enough of it emerged to reveal a nightmare unlike anything nature could have created. The creature's skin resembled bleached stone more than flesh. Thick strands of mineral deposits hung from its body like rotting seaweed. Portions of its frame appeared fused with rock formations, as though it had spent thousands of years sleeping beneath the earth while stone slowly grew around it. The cavern trembled as the giant shifted in the water. Waves slammed into the shore, forcing the team to retreat farther into the chamber. "What is that?" Lisa whispered. No one answered. No one could. The creature's enormous head slowly rose above the lake. Unlike the pale hunter stalking them through the tunnels, this thing possessed no recognizable facial features at all. Its skull-like head was smooth and featureless except for a circular opening in the center. The opening expanded gradually, unfolding into layer after layer of jagged teeth that spiraled inward into darkness. It resembled a gigantic mouth built for swallowing prey whole. Then it released a sound. The noise was so deep that it bypassed their ears entirely. Ethan felt it in his chest. In his bones. The vibration rolled through the cavern like an earthquake. The floating corpses trembled on the water's surface. Dust rained from the ceiling. Several of the stone columns cracked with loud reports that echoed across the lake. Mia covered her ears and screamed. The sound triggered an immediate reaction. The giant mouth turned toward the shoreline. Toward them. For the first time, the team understood a terrifying truth. The creature had known they were there all along. The enormous body shifted beneath the water. Waves surged forward. Then, with shocking speed for something so massive, the creature lunged. A wall of black water exploded toward the shore. Ethan barely had time to dive aside before a colossal arm crashed into the rock where he had been standing moments earlier. The impact shattered stone and sent fragments flying through the air. "Move!" Ethan shouted. The team ran. Behind them, the underground lake erupted into chaos. Massive limbs smashed against the shoreline as the colossal creature attempted to pull itself from the water. Every movement shook the cavern. Ancient stone columns toppled one after another. Sections of ceiling collapsed into the lake with thunderous splashes. The entire chamber seemed on the verge of destruction. The explorers raced through a narrow passage branching away from the lake. None of them knew where it led. Survival was their only concern. Their lights bounced wildly across the walls as they sprinted through the darkness. Behind them, the monstrous roars continued to echo, growing fainter only as distance separated them from the lake. Eventually the tunnel widened into another corridor, allowing the team to stop briefly and catch their breath. Everyone was exhausted. Covered in dust. Soaked from the waves that had struck the shore. For several moments, nobody spoke. The silence felt unnatural after the chaos they had escaped. Then Jacob looked behind them. His face immediately drained of color. "Ethan." The tone of his voice made everyone turn. At the far end of the corridor, barely visible within the darkness, stood the pale creature. The hunter. It had followed them. Unlike the colossal horror beneath the lake, this thing made no sound. It simply stood motionless, its impossible body partially concealed by shadows. The vertical mouth running down its face remained closed. Watching. Waiting. The sight was somehow more terrifying than the giant creature in the lake. Because this one seemed intelligent. Deliberate. Patient. As the team stared, the creature slowly tilted its head. Then another pale figure stepped out of the darkness beside it. Then another. And another. The explorers felt their blood run cold. The first creature had never been alone. One by one, pale forms emerged from the shadows until at least a dozen of them stood clustered within the corridor. Tall. Thin. Silent. Their mouths remained closed as they observed the terrified humans from a distance. Sarah suddenly remembered the ancient mural. The giant black figure surrounded by countless smaller shapes. At the time, they had assumed the smaller figures were humans. Now she realized the horrifying truth. They weren't. The giant creature beneath the lake wasn't the hunter. It wasn't the thing imprisoned beneath Mammoth Cave. It was something else entirely. Something even the pale creatures feared. And judging by the way the hunters remained perfectly still instead of attacking, they were not pursuing the expedition. They were fleeing. The realization struck Ethan like a bolt of ice. The pale creatures were retreating from the lake. Retreating from whatever had awakened there. Then, from somewhere far behind them, a roar echoed through the tunnels. The sound was louder than before. Closer than before. The cavern floor trembled violently beneath their feet. Dust poured from cracks in the ceiling. And for the first time since they had encountered them, fear appeared in the hunter's behavior. The pale creatures immediately turned toward the darkness behind them. Listening. Waiting. Then, without warning, every one of them began running. Not toward the humans. But past them. Racing deeper into the cave system as if something unimaginably worse was coming. Something so terrifying that even the monsters of Mammoth Cave were desperate to escape. The hunters vanished into the darkness with impossible speed, leaving the team standing alone in the trembling corridor. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant roar echoing through the endless tunnels of Mammoth Cave. Whatever had awakened beneath the underground lake was coming, and even the creatures that had stalked them through the cave were running from it. Ethan looked at the exhausted faces around him and realized they no longer understood what they had discovered. What began as a routine exploration had become something far beyond science, beyond history, and beyond human understanding. Hidden beneath the world's longest cave system was an ecosystem of nightmares that had remained sealed away for thousands of years. The team followed the direction taken by the fleeing hunters, moving through passage after passage as the cave continued to shake around them. Along the way, they discovered more evidence left behind by the ancient civilization that once inhabited these depths. Entire walls were covered with carvings depicting a great imprisonment, a desperate effort to lock something away beneath layer after layer of stone. The deeper they looked, the more they realized the horrifying truth. The ancient people had never built those chambers to worship a god. They had built them as a prison. A prison designed to hold something so dangerous that generations had sacrificed their lives to keep it contained. And somehow, after thousands of years, that prison had finally failed. Hours later, battered and nearly out of supplies, the surviving members of the expedition stumbled upon an old shaft leading upward. No one knew whether it had been created by nature or by the ancient people who once lived below. All they knew was that it represented their only chance of escape. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, pulling themselves higher while distant roars echoed beneath them. Eventually, they saw something they thought they might never see again, a faint beam of sunlight shining through a crack in the rock above. One by one, they emerged onto the surface, collapsing onto the forest floor beneath the Kentucky sky. When rescue teams finally reached them, their story was met with skepticism. Authorities listened to their accounts, reviewed the footage that survived, and examined the few artifacts they managed to bring back. Yet much of the evidence had been lost deep underground. The cameras had failed. The tunnels they described could not be relocated. Several entrances had collapsed during the seismic activity that followed their escape. Official reports attributed the strange events to exhaustion, disorientation, and geological instability. In the eyes of the world, Mammoth Cave remained exactly what it had always been, a remarkable natural wonder and nothing more. But the survivors knew the truth. Months later, Sarah spent countless nights studying the carvings they had photographed. One symbol continued to haunt her. It appeared repeatedly near the end of every mural. At first she believed it represented death. Later, she realized it meant something far worse. The symbol did not signify an ending. It signified awakening. One evening, unable to sleep, she enlarged one of the final images from the hidden chamber. For the first time, she noticed a detail she had overlooked. The ancient artists had depicted the imprisoned creature breaking free from beneath the earth. Above it stood small figures watching from the surface. Beside them was a series of marks representing time. Not years. Not centuries. Thousands of years. The carving had never been a record of the past. It had been a warning about the future. A warning that one day the prison would fail. A warning that something buried in the deepest darkness of Mammoth Cave would eventually awaken. And as Sarah stared at the ancient image, her phone vibrated with a news alert. A group of surveyors working near a remote section of Mammoth Cave had reported unusual tremors beneath the ground. Witnesses claimed to have heard strange sounds emerging from newly formed cracks in the rock. Authorities dismissed the reports as natural geological activity. Sarah closed the article and looked out the window into the darkness. Far away beneath the hills of Kentucky, beyond the mapped passages and tourist trails, beyond the chambers known to science, something ancient still moved through the endless tunnels. Something that had survived for millennia beneath the earth. Something that had been waiting. And now that it was awake, it was no longer waiting alone. The darkness beneath Mammoth Cave had opened once again. And whatever lived there was still hungry. The end.